In June 2024, Putin visited Pyongyang for the first time in 24 years. He and Kim Jong Un exchanged gifts, including limousines and, naturally, artwork depicting Putin. The two countries signed a new strategic partnership that included a mutual defense agreement. But amidst the pomp, Putin was coming cap in hand, as he's likely set to make vital economic and technological concessions to the North Koreans he didn't have as much regard for in the past. These events would not have come to fruition if Putin's military were doing better in Ukraine. A little over 2 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. Why did the world's supposedly second most capable military get desperate enough to the point that Russia is now throwing itself into the arms of North Korea? Like many around the world, Putin believed in his military's own hype. He believed Ukraine would fall within days and the rest of the world would just have to deal with it. Instead, he has found himself in an environment that resembles World War I, where making incremental gains at high cost over multiple years is seen as a success. The Russian military has paid dearly in Ukraine. As of June 2024, it's lost over 3,100 tanks, 1,400 armored fighting vehicles, 457 armored personnel carriers, 280 command posts and communication stations, 376 towed artillery pieces, 383 MLRS units, 137 helicopters, 118 aircraft, and 26 ships and submarines, among others. These figures are from Oryx and are considered an undercount because they are only the visually confirmed losses. The latest casualty figures are even grimmer. British sources estimate that 450,000 Russians have become casualties in Ukraine, with more than 50,000 deaths. French sources believe the Russians have suffered 150,000 killed. Ukraine estimates that Russia has suffered 550,000 casualties. According to a collaboration between the BBC and Mediazona, an independent Russian source, the Wagner Group suffered 20,000 deaths in the Battle of Bakhmut. 88% of the deaths were the convict soldiers Russia had been forced into recruiting when the regular army suffered dramatic reversals in the second half of 2022. Maybe it shouldn't be surprising that Putin has had recruiting troubles of late. Russia needs new men to continue its current offensive. So far, Putin has avoided issuing another mobilization order. He doesn't want to draft people from Russia's European heartland, because this would expose the country's more influential cohorts to the cost of the war. But the supply of manpower might be running a little short in Siberia. The solution? According to Ukrainian and British intelligence sources, Putin is enlisting mercenaries from Africa to meet his manpower needs. He's reportedly offering a $2,000 sign-up bonus, a $2,200 monthly salary, and the promise of a Russian passport. Recruitment efforts are mainly focusing on men from Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, and Uganda. These countries are poor, and the money the Russians are promising is an enticement to the people there, as it's much more than they can normally be expected to earn. However, any men that come over aren't expected to live long enough to enjoy it, so maybe the Kremlin thinks no harm, no foul. Russia has also suffered ammunition shortages. At one point in the war, Russian gunners were firing 60,000 artillery shells per day, but this quickly depleted their country's stockpile. By late 2023, Russia could fire only 10,000 shells a day, which was roughly equal to Ukraine before its shell hunger set in. The Kremlin estimated that in late 2023, it would need to produce 3 million shells per year to win the war, or about 15,000 per day. At the beginning of this year, that was 5,000 more shells than Russia was firing in Ukraine every day, and 9,000 more than its industry could produce per day. In other words, Russia has gone to North Korea for assistance in this area, not because it wanted to, but because it needed to. Why did the Russian military get into such a quagmire? Why couldn't it get the job done quickly against a force that it outnumbered and outgunned? The answer is that a military requires a lot of things to work in harmony behind the scenes in order to function effectively, and the Russian armed forces lacked much of it. Putin believing his military's own hype is the biggest reason why Russia got into this position. Intelligence failures have abounded in Ukraine from before the war to the present, which is ironic because Putin himself is a KGB man. The Federal Security Bureau, or FSB, which is responsible for internal security and also specializes in espionage in former Soviet states, failed to anticipate the resistance Russia would get in Ukraine, even as its unit for Ukrainian affairs swelled in size, and even as contradictory information came in before the invasion. For example, the FSB took polls of the population and found that large segments were prepared to resist an invasion. However, the spooks either ignored this or failed to absorb the information, so the Kremlin kept getting favorable reports. The idea that the Ukrainian population would greet the Russians as liberators came from the FSB, which was good enough for them, perhaps, because it was exactly what Putin wanted to hear. However, this miscalculation was far from the FSB's only failure. The idea that Russian paratroopers could create an air corridor by seizing airports and flying reinforcements also originated with the FSB. In fact, Ukrainian intelligence detected joint planning between the FSB and Russia's paratroopers, a level of interaction that was unusual. FSB agents were also spotted at Hostomel Airport shortly before the invasion. However, this intelligence also proved inadequate. Ukrainian resistance prevented Hostomel from falling. The FSB not only underestimated Ukraine's capacity to resist and overestimated how well Russian paratroopers could defend the airport in the time heavier reinforcements were supposed to arrive, it also underestimated Ukraine's air defenses. None of Russia's air corridors were established. What makes things even worse for the FSB is that Ukraine's security services were supposed to have been heavily infiltrated by Russian spies. However, Ukraine in fact went on a dedicated reordering of its intelligence services, notably of the SBU, its main internal security division, with the help of Western agencies like the CIA and MI6. The purge was so extensive that Zelensky even removed the leader of the SBU, Ivan Bakanov, from his post in July 2022, despite his being a childhood friend. The more capable SBU has proven more than a match for Russia's spies. Putin's weak military doctrine is also to blame for many of the failures. Failure to use aviation adequately against Ukraine's air defenses has ensured that Russia still hasn't achieved air superiority despite its air force significantly outnumbering Ukraine's. Putin's failures in implementing combined arms doctrine have been a significant source of embarrassment. Without proper infantry and air support, Russian tanks were sitting ducks for ambushes, an outright disaster. This isn't the first time that Russia has faced such issues. During the Chechen Wars of the 1990s and early 2000s, similar mistakes were made, but no lessons were learned. Unlike Russia, the United States adapted from its experiences in the War on Terror. American tactics involved turning tanks toward the direction of an ambush, utilizing the thick frontal armor to withstand attacks, while infantry suppressed the ambush. In stark contrast, Russian tanks in Ukraine stopped and retreated when ambushed, lacking any infantry support. This tactic led to tank columns grinding to a halt in the war's early days and has contributed to the ongoing high attrition rates of Russian tanks. But the blunders don't stop with tanks. At the core of Putin's failures lies sheer incompetence. This incompetence has been a critical factor in why Russia couldn't achieve a swift victory and continues to struggle, advancing only at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. One of the simplest reasons the Russian military has suffered so much is because of a lack of proper maintenance of its mechanized assets. Thousands of Russian vehicles have been lost due to abandonment or capture rather than destruction or damage. Before the war, the Russians neglected to tend to even the most basic maintenance tasks, like ensuring that there were spare parts available for repairs. In the early days of the war, there was such a shortage of spare parts that in some instances, Russian soldiers needed to loot Ukrainian junkyards to find the parts to keep their vehicles in proper repair. In what may be the worst case of neglect, the Russians failed to rotate their military vehicles when they were parked in storage in the build-up to the war. Competent militaries understand that these vehicles must be rotated from time to time to prevent the sun from damaging the tires. Over time, the sun will break down the rubber of the tires exposed to it. The Russians didn't seem to comprehend this fact, and the end result was that many of their vehicles broke down and had to be abandoned. To make matters worse, the Russians equipped their vehicles with cheap Chinese-made tires before the war began. Specifically, these were the Yellow Sea YS-20 tires. Trent Telenko, a former quality auditor for the US Army's tactical vehicles, called this tire a bad copy of the Michelin XZL military tire. These Chinese tires are ill-equipped to carry loads as heavy as the Russian vehicles demand. But the Russian military had a higher budget that could have purchased better quality tires. Where did the difference go? Into the pockets of corrupt Russian officers, of course, and we'll come to them in greater depth shortly. They figured the Chinese tires were good enough. Unfortunately for the Russians, they discovered that there was a high cost to those low prices when go time actually came. One wonders if China's People's Liberation Army is worried about how their tires might affect their own armored vehicles in the event of war. Poor maintenance extends to other aspects of Russia's military vehicles too. One major reason why so many tanks have been destroyed, especially early in the war, was due to the poor use of explosive reactive armor, ERA. This armor is designed to disrupt incoming projectiles like RPGs. When an anti-tank round impacts ERA, it explodes, setting them off before they can impact the main body of the tank. However, Russia had a poor record of equipping this armor to its tanks, stretching back to the wars in Chechnya. Things didn't change in Ukraine. 6 months after the invasion, the UK Ministry of Defense reported that Russian forces had failed to properly fit and employ adequate ERA to their tanks. It's highly likely that many Russian tank crews lack the training to maintain ERA, leading to either poor fitting of the explosive elements or it being left off entirely. These deficiencies probably contribute to the widespread incidents of turret ejection, which are well documented in eyewitness videos from Ukraine. Corruption in a military leads to poor results on the battlefield. Any disruption to an armed force's supply chain will devastate it in the field long before the enemy does. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, Russian logistics officers are as much to blame for the staggering losses in Ukraine as the Ukrainians themselves are. The Russian logistics officers have been such good allies to Ukraine that in the opening phase of the war, Ukraine's National Agency on Corruption Prevention sent a thank you letter to Sergei Shoigu, the Russian Minister of Defense, for his generous cooperation in ensuring high levels of corruption among the officers that were supposed to be under his watch. Case in point, ERA panels are valuable to sell, and many Russian officers have been unable to resist the opportunity. In the early days of the war, Ukraine found that many of the Russian tanks it had captured were not equipped with ERA. Instead, the bags supposed to contain these panels were found with contents that looked like egg cartons. These were likely plastic fillers rather than egg cartons, designed to make sand inside the bags harder. Either way, the contents were not appropriate replacements for ERA and did little to protect the tanks against Ukraine's anti-tank weapons. Russia's problems distributing poor body armor are even worse than with adequately defending its tanks. Russian troops, especially the soldiers mobilized in late 2022, were not equipped with sufficient protection, which is partly to blame for so many of them dying or being maimed on the battlefield. Why was there such a problem? Partially because the bullet-resistant ceramic plates inside the modern body armor are valuable, and Russian logistics officers made a killing selling these as a side hustle. The body armor that Ukrainian forces later captured revealed that it was often lined with cardboard instead. Luckier soldiers got armor equipped with metal plates. Unfortunately for them, luck in this case is a relative term, because viral videos on social media revealed that Ukrainian soldiers could easily bend it over their knees. Pistol rounds easily penetrated the armor, let alone standard rifle rounds. Even worse off, Russian soldiers got airsoft body armor designed for paintball games. The problem goes deeper than body armor and applies to the most basic of items. It turns out that 1.5 million uniforms went missing too. These are also valuable resale items, and Russian officers decided other people could use them better than the troops under their command. And the Vanishing Act applies to much bigger equipment as well. You'd think a tank would be easy to track and hard to miss, but apparently not in Russia. Incompetence and corruption in the Russian military is so rife that thousands of modern T-72 and T-80 tanks that were supposed to be in storage have been cannibalized or sold off in pieces. The result, particularly in that critical first year of the war, was that Russia faced a shortage of modern tanks and needed to break out the more archaic tanks, like the supposedly retired T-62 and even 1950s-era T-54 or T-55 tanks. Without proper tanks and support vehicles, Russia's grand offensive stalled and reversed to the point that it lost thousands of square miles of territory. Putin's sheer incompetence has also extended to something as basic as providing security for a static convoy. Air defense systems were knocked out by Ukrainian airstrikes because the Russian soldiers nearby neglected to turn on their radars. It didn't help that Russian convoys were parked for so long because they lacked fuel. How does one of the world's leading energy-producing countries run out of fuel? The answer is that Russia simply lacked the number of trucks it needed to supply the convoys in Ukraine during the early days of the war, when the Russian military's effectiveness should have been at its height. The Russian military has instead relied, and still relies, heavily on its supporting rail network. Although the railroads are easy to repair even when Ukraine damages them, the problem is getting supplies from the railheads to where the combat is actually taking place. Russia had too few trucks on hand to do this, especially because the cheap Chinese tires ensured that many of them couldn't successfully complete the journey. Meanwhile, Ukrainian soldiers made this logistical bottleneck worse for their enemy by deliberately targeting the trucks, over and above even tanks. Tanks needed to be refueled and their crews need to stay fed. Without those two things, even the best tank is useless. The Russian military also simply has chain of command issues. It's much more hierarchical than the US military. Instead of training junior officers to take the initiative with the support of a professional cadre of non-commissioned officers, the Russian military is top-heavy, relying on senior officers to make tactical decisions. This top-heavy structure ensures that the Russian military is slow to act while risking the lives of senior officers on the battlefield. By the end of 2023, 12 Russian generals were confirmed to have been killed in Ukraine. Why are so many Russian generals being killed? This is partly because of the excellent intelligence Ukraine and its allies have gathered, but it's also because the Russian generals don't trust their subordinates, and given the rampant corruption among them, it isn't hard to understand why. It's also simply difficult for Russia's senior officers to communicate with their subordinates, meaning that they need to take greater risks. Although the situation has gotten much better since the war began, in the early days, Russian troops were turning to unsecured civilian radios. To make matters even more embarrassing, Russian troops were unable to use their cryptophone system, once touted as the world's most secure communications channel, because it relies on 3G and 4G connections. The problem was that Russian troops destroyed the cell towers in the areas they occupied in Ukraine, as their superior officers neglected to inform them of the importance of those towers for their communications. Now, without their secure signals, the Ukrainians and their allies intercepted the unprotected communications, and when HIMARS came into play later in 2022, Ukraine was able to use the rockets to hit vital targets far away, all thanks to poor signal security in the Russian ranks. And even though Russia has been gaining ground this year, the cost of all these failures, even if they aren't as bad as before, are ballooning. Between January and April 2024, Russia sustained an estimated 82,870 casualties. This would lead to about 331,000 casualties total for the year if the trend continues. Since these figures come from Ukrainian sources, they may be an overestimate, as both sides have tended to overstate their effectiveness against their respective enemy throughout the war. However, even accounting for normal fluctuations, this pace would be far more than enough to kill or maim the 100,000 troops that the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense estimates will be needed to ensure a Ukrainian victory in the war of attrition sometime in 2025. It turns out that those cheap tires, poor maintenance, bad tactics, command incompetence, and the rampant corruption in the Russian ranks were critical components leading to the stalled convoys of the early days of the war. If Russia had taken better care of its vehicles and troops, its early offensives toward Kyiv and elsewhere might have met with more success, at a time when Ukraine was far less well armed than it is now. Instead, Russia's incompetence and corruption guaranteed that it could not win the war at the time best suited for a decisive moment. Russia was instead forced to fight a costly war of attrition that saw it isolated from most of the world. And although some things have gotten better through the harsh lessons of the battlefield, the Russian military is still unwieldy and incompetent, relying on sheer mass for success. Now, to prevent a loss in the war of attrition, Russia has made itself more dependent on China, Iran, and even North Korea. Amidst the celebrations in Pyongyang, Putin might be thinking in the back of his mind, how did it come to this? If so, he should have started by looking in the mirror. What other reasons can you think of as to why it's come to this? What else is wrong with Russia's military? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.